All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Pat Hatzenbuehler. I'm an extension specialist for crop economics at the University of Idaho, based at the Twin Falls Research and Extension Center. And it's my pleasure to deliver to you the 2023 outlook for potatoes. Why is it a pleasure to deliver this outlook? Because we love potatoes. We love to grow them in Idaho. We love to eat them in Idaho and throughout the U.S., throughout the world. And an indicator of that, as an economist, is the price elasticity of demand. And what that concept is the extent to which people change their quantity demanded in response to a price change. And so Richards and Kaiser, in a nice study from 2017, estimated that elasticity to be negative 0.6. Since that's, as an absolute value, less than 1, that implies for any price increase by percentage, a corresponding quantity demand response would be lower by percentage. And so that means that if a price increases for potatoes, people don't change their behavior with regard to their consumption by an equal amount. And so, and that just is another indicator, another way to say that we love to eat potatoes and we'll pay more even if the price increases. Other indicators are just the overall value of how many potatoes are produced and consumed. And one indicator is, or statistic, is overall cash receipts for the U.S. and for Idaho. So cash receipts from potatoes for the U.S. is about $3.7 billion, and almost $1 billion of that comes from Idaho, big percentage. And in terms of overall cash receipts for Idaho farms, in terms of crops, potatoes account for over 25% and over 10% of all farm cash receipts for Idaho. So potatoes are a big deal. We love them. We love to talk about them. And so in this case, we think it's important to see how things are going to be moving into the new year. But before we do the forecasts, let's look at how things are currently looking in the potato market. First, look at production for the past 5 years, and I have plotted on this graph production estimates, total production for the U.S. and for Canada. U.S. is in the yellow line, and Canada is in the black line. As you can see, there's been a substantial decline in trend in production of potatoes in the U.S. over the past 5 years. There has been a relatively increase in the Canadian production, but that hasn't made up for the decline in production in the U.S. So overall, between U.S. and Canada, production has been declining over the past few years. And if we take in the context that we love to continue to consume potatoes, that means there's a very tight market for potatoes. And that will be an indicator in just a minute when we look at what the prices and demand is. And so I have plotted here, in the yellow line this time I have sales, which is another way to describe demand. And the black line this time I have price. And so in this graph you can see there's a negative correlation between these two variables. When the price is high, quantity demanded tends to be lower, and when the price is lower, quantity demanded, or sales, tend to be higher. But as you can see, due to lower production, sales are also declining. And then over the past 4 years for this graph, 18 to 21, there's been a steep but fluctuating increase in the price trend. And that continued all the way in through 2022, and that reflects the very tight market, as reflected by an index put out by our former colleague and friend Ben Eborn at North American Potato Market News, and his newsletter tracking prices and other kinds of factors throughout the potato market very closely. And I encourage you to access that newsletter if you want to know anything about potato. They cover it all. Ben does a great job with that. And so what I've done is done an average of their fresh weighted average price index for Idaho Burbank potatoes for 2021 and 2022, and it shows that this trend of increase is continued into 2022 by a lot, increase of over 76% from 2021 to 2022. So that indicates when production continued to decline and consumption remains somewhat relatively stable, means that stocks and other things remain low, there's opportunity to have these very big price spikes, and that's what we're observing currently in the potato market as we speak today. So let's look forward to 2023. And what am I going to do for this? Basically provide some forecasts. And how did that work? Well, one thing I could do is just do a black box in which I put things in and don't tell you what happens behind there, and then just provide some forecasts. But I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is rather show you, hopefully, give you insights about how economists do their job. And what we do is we take model and data and come up with results, and we use those results to put out forecasts. And I'm going to show you how that can work. First, let's talk about the model. And the model that I'm using is one that's based on a master's thesis from the Utah State University. That's a nice model, nice framework, but the basic logic of it is that historical relationships between supply, demand, and prices can be informative for what will be happening in the future. And so what we do is basically, in a logical sense, look at these variables that are important for the potato market, gather data on them for how they were in the past, and then estimate their relationships over time as an average estimate to how these variables fluctuate with each other in order to indicate what we would expect based on history to happen next year. So the specifics of the model are as follows. Note that I'm indicating a variable value for the current year with a subscript with the letter T, and then for last year there's a subscript with T minus 1. And so that the previous year, not last year. If it's the current year, it's indicated by T. So the first equation is indicating estimates of area harvested, so in the current year. And so to estimate that, we use information from area harvested in the previous year, the potato price for the U.S. in the previous year, and the U.S. wheat price in the previous year, which is a big substitute crop in rotations for potatoes. The yield estimate is quite straightforward. Current yield is a function of the trend yield. So basically see how yields have been trending over time, and then expect that trend will continue for the next year. And then we'll look at the Idaho potato price, which is a function of demands, the income for overall U.S. consumers, since it's a nationwide consumption of potatoes. People throughout the U.S. are eating potatoes, and then the U.S. potato price from last year. And then we have some kind of equilibrium equations that make the model fit together, such that supply is equal to area harvested in the current year and yield, and then supply is equal to demand, just as a kind of overview to make things fit together. So we have this kind of framework in which we're estimating area harvested, yield, and the potato price for the current year, or in the future year, in the current year, and then use that to predict what would happen in the future year. And we use historical data with a regression analysis for these top three equations and estimate them simultaneously in order to obtain estimates on how these variables relate to each other. And so the data that we use mostly come from the USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service, all of that from area harvested, for prices from the U.S., potatoes and wheat, as well as Idaho potatoes. and yields. The only variable that are not from the USDA NASS are from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the Federal Reserve economic data, and those are on real disposable personal income. And real income means that they're adjusted for inflation, which is an important point for later when we get into results about how that inflation adjustment can make a big difference in that value. So let's look at how the estimation results look. So we did this estimation. Oh, I forgot to mention, this is for 1980 through 2021 for the data, and 2021 is because the data are complete for all of the variables up to 2021. But we're still filming this and doing the analysis at the end of 2022, so some of the data aren't fully available for some of the variables for 2022. And so we use the estimates for through 2021, and then use as much as we can later for the forecast for the 2022 variables. So the results show that previous year area harvested has a positive relationship with area harvested in the current year. U.S. potato price in the previous year has a positive relationship with area harvested in the current year, but the U.S. wheat price has a negative relationship with area harvested in the current year. So that means there's substitution away from potato area harvested or planted from potatoes into wheat or other crops when the wheat price is higher. With regard to the trend, shows that on average, each year potato yields have been increasing on average 4.7 hundredweight per acre per year over time. And so moving into the next year, we would expect yields under normal weather conditions to increase by that amount. And that reflects technological innovation and other kind of factors that can increase yields over time. For the indicators of Idaho potato prices, there's a negative relationship between demand and prices, which we showed earlier in that in the chart of prices and demand, how those are negative related to each other. There's a positive relationship between income and potato prices, so that when people have more income, they tend to consume more potatoes and the price would increase. And the price from last year has a positive relationship with the price this year, which kind of reflects that upward trend that we showed before, of that prices, if they were higher last year, they tend to be higher again in the next year on average. So we can use these estimates to come up with forecasts for the next year. But what I'm calling here forecasting for 2022, because we already know the value of area harvested, it's one of those variables that we have data on for 2022, and so we don't need to forecast, but we can test how good the model is by including the estimates into an equation by plugging in data for relevant data to come up with an estimate. So essentially what we do is take those estimates that we'd explained previously and put them into an equation, and then we plug in data values for 2021, which I have listed in the table here. And so essentially multiply the parameter estimates that reflect the long-term average relationships between the variables, and then the value for the relevant year, in this case it's 2021, and then come up with a value. And so that equation provides an estimate, and for 2022 it's 875.5 million acres harvested. So how good of an estimate was that? Well, actual area we know now is 906.1 million acres. So the good news is that the estimate is lower from 2021 to 2022, so that indicates the direction was correct in terms of that estimate, but there was an error there of about 3.5%, likely due to this equation not accounting for other relevant factors that you might think of, things like wet water outlook, and other things that we'll bring up a bit later to pay attention to in 2023. With regard to the price, we do the exact same type of exercise where we take the parameter estimates from the model of the relationships between price and demand, income, and the previous U.S. potato price, and those relationship parameters, plug in the data for 2022 in this case because it's the current year. And so that's the challenge with some of these types of models, is some of the data aren't fully available for the current year. And so in some cases you need to estimate what a variable would be. So for example, for 2022, for real net disposable income, we just assumed that the data up until now are representative of the whole year, and those becomes a value of 45,243, which is a decline in real income of over $3,000 from 2021. And so that is really reflective of this real income adjustment of not only income increases but also inflation. And so this inflation being over 8% for a lot of the year really bit into real incomes. And so that shows that decline. And so when you put these numbers in of demands reflecting supply, net disposable income declining, and the potato price being somewhat higher, then the potato price for Idaho is 8.31 is what that results in. Well, what does that compare to what we have for information for the overall potato price for 2022? Well, potato prices increased by a lot, and so that indicates that the model would predict the prices to be lower, but they increase by a lot. And so that just maybe reflects things like people being even more willing to continue to consume even though that their real income is declining. The potato market being extraordinarily tight relative to history, such that the price increased a lot more than you would expect. Things like that indicates that the error here with regard to the price is much larger than would be maybe expected in a normal year. And so let's talk about 2023, which is the goal of this presentation. Basically what we do for 2023 estimates are the same exercise that I just went through for 2022 to test the model. But in this case, we need to come up with other estimates for the 2022 values because those aren't available yet. And so basically for the 2022 potato price, we use the North American Potato Market News index adjustment and adjusted the 2021 value to come up with an estimate for the 2022 price, which may have some issues with it because Idaho index may not perfectly relate to the nationwide index, but it's one way to do this, and there are other ways that could be done. For the wheat price for 2021-2022, we use the WASDE report estimate for 2022 from the USDA as an indicator of the wheat price. And so area harvested for 2022 is the output from the previous equation in which we estimated that value. So we include that as the previous year for 2023. And then the U.S. potato price, as I mentioned, is a function of this index multiplied by the 2021 price, and the wheat price is the USDA estimate for 2022. So you put all that in there, and you get an estimate for 2023 of 1,017,000 acres, which is a big increase relative to 2022. So the main takeaway from this is there's a predicted increase based on the model estimates for 2023 relative to 2022. And so we do this last estimation of predicting Idaho prices, potato prices for 2023. And to come up with some estimation of demand, we come up with an estimate of supply. So we just estimated what the estimated area harvested is for 2023. So we need an estimate of yield, and we just use that trend function that I described earlier to come up with the forecasted trend yields for 2023. And then we combine those to come up with the overall supply estimate, which becomes enters into our equation. For net disposable income, we use some assumptions based on forecasts for overall GDP growth and inflation moving forward. So IMF, International Monetary Fund, is estimating that the U.S. economy will grow by 1% in 2023. And then inflation remains somewhat high, so I have an estimate of about 5% inflation, which assumes net disposable income would decline by 4% in 2023. And then the U.S. potato price was as described on the previous slide. So you put all that into the equation based on the estimates from before, and the Idaho potato price for 2023 is estimated at $8.4 per hundredweight, which is a decrease, substantial decrease, from the 2022 price. So that's kind of the main takeaway from this exercise, is if yields are on trend, if historical patterns emerge with regard to area harvested, then the price is expected to be lower throughout 2023. So, in order to summarize what I've projected here, the main supply-related projections are that we expect area planted to be, and harvested to be higher in 2023 relative to 2022 based on the potato price being high, and it being a bigger factor than the wheat price, and based on historical patterns. Trend yields are forecasted, or are estimated at 466 hundredweight per acre. And so you combine those higher area and higher yields, and you get an overall higher supply eventually. So once things get planted in April and May. With regard to demand, lower real income, so the inflation being high implies that real income is going to be lower in 2023, which has a negative impact on demand, and is a depressing factor with regard to the price of potatoes. And so that's the other kind of main prediction, is that prices for 2023 are expected to be lower than 2022. But how much lower? Well, it depends on other kinds of factors, and that's one of the things that may especially the potato experts in the room will acknowledge, is that the model for area estimate didn't account for some of the important factors that we acknowledge. So we did account for prices of other important rotation crops, such as wheat, but we didn't account for things like water outlook, which is a big one, and that's something that Ben Eborn brings up a lot, that producers pay attention to when they're making their planting decisions, especially in Idaho, for how snowpack is and what it's going to look like for irrigation make a big difference about how much area potatoes are planted. Also, we didn't account for fertilizer prices, so that could have a big impact as well about how much potato acres are planted relative to other crops that don't use as much fertilizer, especially these past couple of years of very high fertilizer prices. And also seed availability. Came up last year, is that people couldn't access the seeds that they wanted to in order to plant the acres that they wanted to. And then lastly, so first, before the last point, I just wanted to say that some of this we could probably account for in future iterations of the model that we described. There could be some kind of data estimate on water outlook that we can encompass. Fertilizer prices, we can try to find some kind of historical data based on fertilizer prices to encompass. Seed availability, much more difficult in order to get data on that to encompass. So there's always going to be some error in these forecast models, but we can try to improve them over time and hopefully have opportunity to do that for next year. And lastly, the main factor is how planting, growing, and harvest conditions are, because these are all based on historical patterns, and if planting conditions or growing conditions or harvest conditions aren't ideal for potatoes to grow, then that can impact yields, which translates into impact on supply. And so any of these, in which case there's a deviation from historical trends for yields and from what we would expect. So all of those things are things that to pay attention to moving forward, and things that we hope to be able to account for in future estimation of potato conditions in the future. So thank you very much for your attention today, and hope you enjoyed the presentation.